Hello guys, so in today's video I will talk about whether or not you should stack or track in astrophotography. Now both are legitimate ways in which you can capture the night sky, and both have their own pros and cons. But if you're not sure as to how you can capture the stars, but you want to learn more, it's best that you take single images of the night sky. So now, starting with stacking. Stacking is about taking multiple exposures of your subject and taking calibration frames like dark frames, bias frames, flat frames, and light frames, and then putting them into a dedicated stacking software like Sequator for PC users and Starry Landscape Stacker for Mac users, which I think costs less than $40. So stacking pretty much removes the noise from an image and enhancing the signal to noise ratio, allowing you to pull out more detail in your night sky images without it looking too grainy. Tracking, on the other hand, is where you put your camera on a star tracker or a sky guider, where it makes the camera move along with the sky to cancel out Earth's rotation around its axis, which makes the stars freeze in place, allowing you to get longer exposures to the night sky than what you can get with stacking. When set up properly, you can get exposures of up to 10 minutes. You can drop down your ISO and play around with your aperture. Now the advantages of stacking is that you don't have to invest on any additional equipment. All that you need is a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, a sturdy tripod, and a good wide field lens. More preferably one that has a very low f number, or aperture for that matter. Now there are different softwares that you can use to stack your images. For PC users, there are two of them, which is Deep Sky Stacker and Sequator. Both are free programs. Although Sequator allows you to get better images with a foreground in it, whereas Deep Sky Stacker doesn't handle images with a foreground that well. Now as for Mac users, the stacking software that they can use is called Starry Landscape Stacker, and it doesn't come in for free. I think it's below $40, but you can also get a trial version of Starry Landscape Stacker. Since all that you have to do when it comes to stacking is set up your camera and your tripod, you can immediately compose your shot and then move on to the next quickly. So the setup time is a lot quicker than when you are tracking. Another advantage of stacking is that it gets rid of all of that noise, including the long exposure noise that you get in astrophotography. And another advantage is that you can create not just an image but also a time lapse, which is 2 for the price of 1. And so based on my experience, the best advantage when it comes to stacking is that the setup time is quick and the amount of time that you spend between each composition is short compared to tracking. So the main advantage when it comes to stacking is that the amount of time in between making compositions is far less compared to tracking, allowing you to get more creative compositions in one night. Now, the disadvantages of stacking is that it can take a lot of time when it comes to stacking the images, especially when your computer is not that fast. Sometimes the amount of time to stack your images can range from minutes to hours, depending on how many images you took and on how fast your computer is. And you can end up with TIFF files that can be over a gigabyte big. So if your computer is not that fast, then you will have trouble when it comes to processing your stacked image. But buying Starry Landscape Stacker will be worth it. Now I'm gonna leave links below to Sequator and Deep Sky Stacker for PC and Starry Landscape Stacker for Mac users. Now to recap, the advantages of stacking is that much of the noise in your images gets removed, including the long exposure noise. You can create both an image and a time lapse, which is 2 for the price of 1, and you can also create more creative compositions in one night compared to tracking, since you can quickly move between locations and the setup time is quick as well. And you don't need to invest a lot of money in your gear, since all that you need is a camera, a good wide field camera lens, and a sturdy tripod. And as for the disadvantages, you can end up with files that are very big and you can have trouble processing them in the end. And stacking the files can take a lot of time depending on how fast your computer is. And if you're on a Mac, you have to buy the Starry Landscape Stacker software. And colors will also not be that deep as tracking. Now moving on to tracking. Tracking is simply, like I said before, putting your camera on a sky tracker or a sky guider, depending on the equipment that you use, to cancel out the movement of the night sky by letting your camera move with the stars, thus cancelling out Earth's rotation and freezing the stars in place, allowing you to get longer exposure times, and with that, more detail of the night sky. Now the advantages of tracking is that the colors are deeper in your astro images compared to stacking, and you'll also be able to get more detail in your night sky images than what you can get with stacking, since your camera is allowing in more light for a longer period of time and thus allowing you to capture more of the fainter details of the night sky. and you can drop down your ISO and pretty much soak up those colors of the night sky, including the Milky Way galaxy, making your images look more saturated. And also, by dropping down your ISO, you can also make the stars burst a little bit. So if you're a gearhead and you want to buy more gear, then this is the perfect excuse for you. Now, depending on the camera gear that you use, also determines the kind of star tracker that you will have to buy. If your camera gear is lightweight, then you can go for a star tracker, like the Attribution Sky Tracker Pro, which is built for light gear, like a small camera. But if you have something heavier, like a bigger camera lens or a telescope, then you should buy something like the Attribution Sky Guider Pro, because they can be way beyond the limits of a sky tracker. And with a Sky Guider, you can mount both a camera lens and a telescope at the same time. But if you're aiming for something heavier, then you should buy something more expensive, like the Skywatcher Star Adventurer Pro, which is built for heavier gear. But for me, I would recommend the Attribution Sky Guider Pro, since it is cheaper than the Skywatcher Star Adventurer Pro and is also more durable than the Sky Tracker. And it also depends on the user experience that you're looking for. Now, it can also be really fun learning this new process of astrophotography. Now, since you can go for longer exposures, this also opens up the opportunity not just for wide field shots, but also extreme close-ups of deep sky objects, allowing you to capture more detail of, say, things like the Andromeda galaxy than what you can get without tracking. And if you're really into it, you can start to capture many more things like nebulae, planets, even things like the Andromeda galaxy. Now, one of the main advantages of tracking is that you don't really need fast camera lenses. So now with just a kit lens, you can already capture images of the night sky without getting a lot of noise in your night sky images. Now, one of the disadvantages of tracking is that the setup time can be longer compared to stacking, and the rate at which you spend creating each composition will be longer compared to stacking. And you also have to polar align your star tracker to denote star Polaris. So every time you change location, you have to polar align each time. Now, obviously, you also have to spend money on a star tracker if you want to get into tracking, but it can be worth it in the end. And you also have to learn how to polar align, otherwise your star tracker will not work the way it's supposed to work. So you have to do some research and learn how to polar align quickly. Now, there are also apps out that will help you in your polar alignment. Aside from buying a tracker, you also need to buy a sturdy tripod. So if you have a smaller tripod for your camera, it is better that you invest on a bigger, steadier and stronger tripod. Now, if you're shooting very long exposures, like around 8 or 10 minutes, then you will have to wait for each of those exposures to finish. But if you have a foreground in your images, the foreground will blur out. So you will have to blend two images together to get a clean foreground. Now, if you live someplace hot, you can get long exposure noise in your images. So one way to reduce that is by enabling long exposure noise reduction, which will increase the time frame in between exposures, or you can just capture calibration frames called dark frames and then stacking them on dedicated stacking softwares. Now, both of these take the same amount of time as you did in your initial exposure. So both of them take a very long time, especially with these very long exposures. So to recap, one of the advantages of tracking is that you get deeper colors in your night sky images. You can use smaller apertures and lower ISOs as well. You will also learn a new technique. You can use longer focal lengths without getting motion blur. You're not limited by the 500 rule, and you don't need fast lenses. Now, as for the disadvantages, the setup time can be very long. You need a clear view of Polaris, otherwise you would have to do something called drift alignment. You also have to spend a lot of money in buying a star tracker. You also need a bigger and sturdier tripod. You have to wait for a longer amount of time in between shots. You get more long exposure noise, and you would still have to blend the foreground in if there is a foreground in your composition. So as you can see, both stacking and tracking have their pros and cons. And now the main disadvantage of tracking is that if you want to move in between locations, you will have to polar align again, so you have to spend more time in between compositions. But to make the most out of your night sky images, it is better to do both stacking and tracking at the same time. Also, if you do deep sky astrophotography, doing both stacking and tracking at the same time will surely help you get the most detail out of your deep sky images. Say for example, you want to capture the Andromeda galaxy, or the Lagoon Nebula, or the Orion Nebula in great detail through your telescope, or with a long camera lens. You can get the most out of those images by doing both stacking and tracking at the same time. But even though the amount of time that you have to spend in a single composition will be longer, it will be worth it in the end, allowing you to get get the most out of your astro images. So when capturing the foreground, you will have to turn off your star tracker and then take a series of images of the foreground and blend it later on with your sky images. But if you're in a bit of a rush, you can just stack your images. So both stacking and tracking will allow you to move to the next step in astrophotography. But if you don't have the money to buy a tracker, I suggest that you start with stacking first before moving on to tracking. Because tracking will involve more expensive stuff. Like me, for example, I only do stacking instead of tracking because I don't have the money necessary to buy a star tracker. So if you found this video useful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to me, and share this video to whoever might find it useful. And if you're planning to enjoy the night sky anytime soon, I wish you good luck and clear skies.